Let me tell you something the World Bank didn't want to say out loud. For years, their own reports put India's logistics costs at 14 to 18% of GDP, nearly double the United States, and roughly double Germany's as well. The message underneath those numbers was clear, and it was repeated in boardrooms from London to Singapore. This country could write the world's software, but it couldn't build a road that survived a single monsoon season. Can a democracy of 1.4 billion people, spread across a subcontinent, with a fraction of the per capita wealth of the West, actually outbuild economies many times richer? For most of India's history since independence, the honest answer was no. Roads collapsed under their own weight. Railways ran diesel engines 100 years old. Ports kept ships waiting for days just to unload. So what if I told you that somewhere in the last 10 years, without a single press conference announcing it, that story quietly became false? By the time this video ends, you'll understand why India now operates the world's second largest highway network, is closing in on the world's second largest metro system, has electrified its railways faster than Japan, France, and Britain combined, and has quietly become the third largest producer of renewable energy on the planet. Not promises, not 5-year plans still on paper, numbers, sitting in government ledgers right now, that most of the world has simply never checked. Here's the one number that should stop you before we go any further. In 2014, India's national highway network measured 91,287 kilometers. Today it stands at more than 146,000 kilometers, a 60% expansion in a single decade. That is enough new highway to circle the Earth more than 3 times over, built in the same window of years that some Western nations spent arguing over a single rail line. This isn't one flagship project built for the cameras. It's a coordinated build-out running simultaneously across roads, railways, metros, ports, airports, and power grids. And almost none of it makes international headlines. Let's go through it, one system at a time. The second largest highway network on Earth, 91,000 kilometers in 2014, over 146,000 kilometers today. That's the headline number for India's national highway system, now second in the world only to the United States. But the more revealing number sits underneath it. 4-lane and above corridors, the highways actually built for serious freight and long-distance travel, have grown from roughly 18,400 kilometers in 2014 to more than 46,000 kilometers now, a 2.5 times increase. Annual capital spending on highway construction has climbed more than 9-fold over the same period, and the share of national highways that are still single-lane, the kind that used to define long-distance travel in India, has fallen from around 30% of the total network to roughly 10%. At peak construction rates, India has been adding somewhere between 30 and 40 kilometers of national highway every single day. That's not a rounded-up estimate for effect. That's the sustained pace across full construction years, not isolated months. Put another way, a stretch of highway that used to take the better part of a year to plan, acquire land for, and finish is now being completed in a matter of days at the country's best-performing project sites. A country once known internationally for roads that dissolved under a single monsoon season is now laying pavement faster than most of its critics can update their spreadsheets. The Delhi-Mumbai Expressway, proof at 120 kilometers an hour. If you want one project that captures the entire shift, it's this one. The Delhi-Mumbai Expressway, roughly 1,350 kilometers long, 8 lanes wide, with room reserved for 4 more, is being built to cut travel time between India's political and financial capitals from nearly 24 hours down to 12. It passes through 6 states, and its designers didn't just pour concrete, they built dedicated wildlife crossings so tigers and leopards can move beneath the road undisturbed, something almost no comparable highway project in the developing world has bothered to include. Total cost sits around $12 to $13 billion. For comparison, that's roughly what a single American state has already spent on a train that still hasn't carried a single passenger, a comparison we'll come back to. In 2014, Metro Rail existed in exactly 5 Indian cities, covering barely 248 kilometers combined. Today, metro systems operate in 29 cities, spanning more than 1,140 kilometers of track, making India the 3rd largest metro network on Earth, behind only China and the United States. Almost 1,000 additional kilometers are under construction right now, simultaneously, in cities that had never seen a metro train a decade ago. Ridership has followed the same curve. Close to 11.5 million passengers now use metro systems across the country every single day, a figure that didn't meaningfully exist in most of these cities before 2014. Delhi Metro alone is on track to become the largest single-city metro network in the world, overtaking New York's roughly 400-kilometer system within the current expansion phase. Mumbai's first fully underground metro corridor, the Aqua Line, opened in late 2025, cutting a journey that used to take over an hour through some of the world's worst traffic congestion down to a fraction of that time. Bengaluru's Yellow Line, connecting the city's IT corridor directly to the metro network for the first time, opened the same year. Government officials have openly said India is positioned to overtake the United States for second place globally within the next few years, not through one showcase city, but through parallel construction in a dozen cities at once, each one running its own tunnel-boring machines, its own contractors, and its own timeline, all converging on the same national outcome: railway electrification, beating Japan, France, and Britain. This is the fact almost nobody outside India knows, and it deserves to stop you cold. As of mid-2026, Indian Railways has electrified 99.6% of its broad-gauge network. That places India second in the entire world, behind only Switzerland. For comparison, China sits at roughly 82% electrified, Spain, 67%, Japan, 64%, France, around 60%, the United Kingdom, just 37%. The United States, the wealthiest economy on the planet, has electrified barely 1% of its rail network. A country once mocked worldwide for images of passengers riding on train roofs has quietly out-electrified nearly every industrialized nation on Earth, and the payoff isn't symbolic. Annual diesel consumption on the network has fallen from roughly 2.93 billion liters a year in 2015-16 to about 1.08 billion liters today. An entire second railway, built just for cargo India, didn't stop at upgrading its existing rail lines. It built a second, parallel freight-only railway system from scratch. The eastern and western dedicated freight corridors span a combined 2,843 kilometers, stretching from Punjab in the north to Bihar in the east, and from Mumbai's ports inland to Uttar Pradesh. For decades before this project existed, India's freight trains and passenger trains fought for space on the exact same tracks. A coal wagon holding up an express train, a container shipment sitting idle so a scheduled passenger service could pass. That single structural conflict quietly throttled the efficiency of the entire national rail network for the better part of a century. As of 2026, the freight corridor network is fully commissioned and fully electrified, running double-stacked container trains at speeds up to 100 kilometers an hour, 3 to 4 times faster than freight ever moved when it shared tracks with passenger trains. On the newly electrified Western Corridor, container transit time from Mumbai's ports inland dropped from 3 to 4 days down to a matter of hours. Over 300 freight trains now run across the dedicated network daily, and a newly announced third corridor, connecting Dankuni to Surat across 5 states, has already entered fast-tracked pre-construction. That's not a railway upgrade. That's a second national logistics spine, laid down underneath the country that already existed, built specifically to solve a bottleneck nobody outside India ever had reason to think about. Vande Bharat and the bullet train nobody thought would happen. Alongside the freight corridors, India built its own semi-high-speed passenger trains entirely in-country, rather than importing the technology wholesale. Over 160 Vande Bharat trains now run across the network at speeds up to 160 kilometers an hour, designed and manufactured domestically, connecting cities that previously relied on decades-old diesel rolling stock with modern, air-conditioned, sensor-equipped trains built on Indian production lines. Running parallel to that effort, construction continues on India's first true bullet train, the roughly 508-kilometer Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed corridor, built using Japanese Shinkansen technology, with the majority of its funding coming from concessional Japanese loans. When the project was first announced, critics inside and outside India dismissed it as an expensive vanity exercise the country couldn't realistically finish. Today, well over 100 kilometers of elevated track already stand. A multi-kilometer undersea and underground tunnel section is being actively bored beneath Thane Creek, and the first sets of physical rolling stock are expected to arrive in the country ahead of trial runs. Passenger service is targeted for 2027. The concrete disagrees with the critics a little more each month. Cutting ship turnaround time in half ports rarely make it into infrastructure conversations. But the numbers here are just as dramatic. Under the Sagarmala Port Modernization Program, launched in 2015, the average turnaround time for a ship at a major Indian port has fallen from 96 hours to under 50 hours today. And some government officials now cite figures closer to a single day at India's best-performing terminals, an improvement that outpaced the program's own projections made just a few years earlier. Container turnaround specifically has dropped from over 32 hours to around 30 hours in just the last few years alone, and that trend line keeps bending the same direction. Cargo handling capacity at Indian ports has grown from around 1,400 million tons a year in 2013-14 to over 2,800 million tons today, essentially doubling. In the fiscal year that just closed, India's major ports handled a record 915 million tons of cargo, beating the government's own annual target by more than 11 million tons. Meanwhile, India's inland waterways, rivers and canals used to move cargo instead of trucking it, carried 145 million tons of freight this past year, up from a mere 18 million tons in 2014. That's a 700% increase in a form of transport most countries treat as a historical curiosity rather than active infrastructure. 9 Indian ports now rank among the global top 100 for efficiency, a list India had almost no presence on a decade ago. An airport built almost every month for a decade won. In 2014, India had 74 operational airports. Today, that number stands above 160, meaning the country has added, on average, close to 1 new airport every single month for 10 straight years. The UDAN Regional Connectivity Scheme, launched in October 2016 to bring air travel to towns that had never had an airstrip worth using, has carried over 16 million passengers across more than 600 routes since launch. Ordinary people in places like Darbhanga, Shivamogga, and Jharsuguda, who had never had a viable flight option in their lives, now do. A newly expanded phase of the scheme, approved with a budget of roughly 28,840 crore rupees, now targets 100 more airports built from unserved airstrips and 200 modern helipads over the next 8 years, with a national goal of exceeding 350 operational airports by 2047. India has become the third largest domestic aviation market in the world, built not around a handful of flagship international hubs, the way aviation growth usually happens, but around dozens of smaller, previously ignored cities that had been left off the map entirely. That's a different kind of aviation expansion than most countries attempt, spreading capacity outward into places with no prior air infrastructure at all, rather than simply expanding the airports that already existed. Renewable energy, third in the world, and still accelerating. India's installed renewable energy capacity has grown nearly fourfold in a decade, from 76.4 gigawatts in 2014 to roughly 288.6 gigawatts by mid-2026. Solar power alone accounts for more than 162 gigawatts of that total, having crossed the 150 gigawatt mark for the first time in the country's history earlier this year. Wind capacity now sits above 57 gigawatts, more than double where it stood just 5 years ago. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency's own 2026 statistics, India has now overtaken Brazil to rank third in the world for total installed renewable capacity, trailing only China and the United States. In July 2025, renewables briefly supplied more than half of India's total electricity demand in a single day, a milestone that used to be treated as decades away for a country of this size and this population. And this isn't slowing down. In just the first 6 months of 2026, India added nearly 29 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity, a record for any 6-month period in the country's history, with Gujarat and Rajasthan alone accounting for more than half of the new solar installations nationwide. The government's target is 500 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030. At the current pace, That target is no longer ambition. It's arithmetic. Gati Shakti. The map that connects all of it home. None of the previous 9 segments happened in isolation, and that's the part almost no international coverage captures. For decades, Indian infrastructure suffered from a specific, well-documented failure. A highway would be built without knowing where the metro would eventually run. A port would sit disconnected from the freight corridor meant to serve it. An industrial zone would be approved without anyone confirming the power grid could actually reach it. Roads and rail and ports and power were planned by different ministries that rarely spoke to each other, and the result was waste, measured in years of delay and in crores of rupees spent fixing avoidable gaps after the fact. The PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan, launched in October 2021, was built to end that specific failure. It layers highway, rail, port, airport, and power project data, 16 ministries worth of planning information, onto a single digital map, so that new projects are designed to connect to what already exists, rather than duplicating it or leaving it stranded. A highway now knows, before a single shovel goes into the ground, where the nearest metro line and freight corridor will eventually run. It's the least glamorous project on this list. There's no ribbon-cutting ceremony for a database, and arguably the one that made every other number in this video possible. None of this happened without real friction, and it didn't happen instantly, and it isn't finished. Land acquisition remains, by the Indian government's own admission, one of the single biggest bottlenecks slowing project timelines even now. A dispute over compensation or ownership can stall a highway corridor for years, and several of the projects mentioned in this video are running behind their original completion dates for exactly that reason. Environmental clearances for routes crossing forest and wildlife zones added real, multi-year delay to projects like the freight corridors and the expressway network, and rightly so. Building fast is not an excuse to build carelessly. Years of stressed bank balance sheets, tied to poorly structured infrastructure financing from the 2000s and early 2010s, made new project lending harder to secure for much of the last decade, and some state-level projects still struggle to attract the private financing that national flagship projects can command. And the comparison that actually matters here isn't an invented villain, it's a documented, publicly reported one. Britain's HS2 high-speed rail project has seen its scope repeatedly cut, entire sections cancelled outright, and its budget balloon years behind the original schedule. California's high-speed rail project, approved by voters in 2008 with an estimated cost near $33 billion, now carries an official 2026 business plan estimate above $200 billion, with no completed high-speed section and 0 passengers carried to date, despite $15 to $20 billion already spent and construction underway for well over a decade. Even the most optimistic current timeline suggests limited service in California's Central Valley might not begin until the early 2030s, with a full Los Angeles to San Francisco connection still uncertain. None of that is exaggeration for effect. It's the publicly available business plan, the publicly reported budget overruns, sitting right next to India's own numbers for comparison. The contrast doesn't need embellishment. It's already sharp enough on its own. A country with a fraction of the per capita wealth of the US or UK is, on several specific and measurable fronts, now moving faster, while still dealing with its own very real construction delays, financing gaps, and land disputes along the way. Every kilometer of highway built since 2014 is a rejection of the old assumption that Indian infrastructure would always lag behind its ambitions. Every percentage point of rail electrification is proof that a democracy of 1.4 billion people can out-execute economies many times richer when the coordination is right. Every gigawatt of solar capacity added to the grid is a small, unglamorous act of energy independence. Proof that a nation once dependent on imported coal and oil is quietly rewriting its own energy future without waiting for anyone's permission to do it. Every hour shaved off a ship's turnaround time at a major port is proof that the same country once flagged by the World Bank for crippling logistics costs has been systematically dismantling the exact bottlenecks that report identified. None of these are separate achievements happening to coexist by coincidence. A highway that reaches a port faster feeds a freight corridor that reaches a city faster, which feeds a factory that ships faster, which lowers the exact logistics cost figure that started this whole story. That's what the Gati Shakti coordination layer was actually built to produce. Not 11 separate infrastructure wins, but one connected system where each piece makes every other piece more valuable. This isn't the India that outdated consultancy reports described a generation ago. It isn't the India of the stereotypes people still repeat about congestion, delay, and endless bureaucracy. Stereotypes that, to be fair, held real truth in them for a very long time. It's a country that took the single most legitimate criticism ever leveled against it, that it could dream big but couldn't build at scale, and spent a decade making that criticism progressively, measurably, verifiably obsolete. 1 kilometer, 1 gigawatt, 1 electrified rail line at a time. So the next time somebody repeats the old line, that India is a country of good intentions and bad execution, ask them when they last actually checked the numbers. Ask them if they know India electrifies rail faster than Japan. Ask them if they know India is closing in on the United States for the world's second-largest metro network. Ask them if they know a country once criticized for the slowest ports in Asia now counts 9 of them among the world's top 100 for efficiency. Ask them to put a highway map of India from 2014 next to one from today and tell you, honestly, what they see. The infrastructure story of the next decade isn't being written in Washington or in London. It's being laid down, kilometer by kilometer and gigawatt by gigawatt, in a country that stopped waiting for anyone's approval a long time ago. And that, unlike the flashier headlines about rockets and reactors, almost nobody outside India has bothered to notice. If this surprised you the way it surprised us putting it together, share it with someone who still pictures Indian infrastructure the way headlines described it 20 years ago. The data has already moved on. It's time the conversation caught up with it.